On today's Zoffy, we're going to be talking about the Alberta government's decision to extend the deadline of the public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaigns and for another 4 months, and to give it another $1 million. Now, this has been going on for a year already. It was supposed to report on July 2nd, and now it won't do that until October 30th. And this is essentially an investigation into the allegations of foreign-funded activists that came out of the work, I won't call it research, but out of the work done by Vancouver blogger Vivian Krause. To discuss that, I'm joined by Sandy Garossino, who is a lawyer and a writer for the National Observer, and she and I together have written pieces separately, but we have both done work debunking the foreign-funded activist trope. And so welcome to the Zoffy, Sandy.
Thanks for having me on, Markham.
Now,
and hi, everybody.
This is a very complex issue. And so I'm going to give just a brief overview. And Sandy did her work, her journalism investigative work on the financial end of things with the charities and how money flows and how charities operate in Canada and the US. My work was interviewing environmental groups that received some of that funding and how that all worked, what the amounts were, and so on. So here's what Ms. Krause did. Around the 2010, she was rooting around in online IRS databases down in the US, and she discovered that foundations, American foundations, were sending money to Canadian environmental groups for anti-pipeline activism, specifically the tar sands campaign. And so what she did is that she went and traced all of these expenditures, these transfers, and she came up with a figure of $40 million over roughly 10 years. And then what she did, and this is the way conspiracy theories, narratives always work. There is some truth to it. So there was $40 million transferred to between 50 and 150 environmental groups. They did engage in anti-pipeline activism, and that is the core truth that Vivian discovered. And then the rest of it is conjecture and mistaken assumptions and all of the grist that goes to make up a conspiracy narrative. And so this had consequences. In 2013, 2014, I think it was, when Stephen Harper was prime minister, they used that as Vivian's work as an excuse to investigate Canadian charities. It was long series of audits, cost everybody a lot of money, didn't reveal anything. And lately, during the 2018 campaign, Jason Kenney promised that he would set up an inquiry into this foreign-funded activism based on Vivian's research. That is a very high-level view of what was going on. And so Sandy debunked Jason Kenney's assumptions around what the charities were doing. I did the work on the NGOs. So why don't we start with what you found out, Sandy? And I think a really critical piece here is how charities actually operate, because Vivian got that entirely wrong.
Very much so, and probably in particular with regard to tides. And there's so again, I prefer to talk about the research that is the foundation of the Alberta inquiry and also the CRA audits, rather than personalizing it to the original source. But just to talk about that research, where to start? I mean, it's almost wrong from beginning to end. Probably the number one thing that the public needs to know, well, first of all, is that the tar sands campaign is a precise campaign. There are different organizations that are funded at different times through it. It is a fund, and various foundations in the US and also in Europe pay into the fund that is managed by organizations that are called donor-advised funds, or managed as donor-advised funds, and those are managed by what are the equivalent of financial institutions. So it's almost like there's a banking function where foundations, 90% of international major foundation grants are managed by separate institutions, and then they're distributed. So there's like a banking function, and that's called a DAF, a donor advised fund, and that's what Tides US did. There are also other funds, New Venture Foundation. Those foundations or those institutions don't have any original funding role at all of their own. Tides US has not given a single dollar to the tar sands campaign of its own money. If you imagine that this is like, say, RBC or Bank of Montreal, where funds are distributed, where funds are put on deposit. Say you're a funder, you're the Gates Foundation. In fact, the Gates Foundation has used Tides US and has done so, I think, to make grants into Canada, if I'm not mistaken. But they'll put funds on deposit at the bank, let's call it the Bank of Montreal. And then when the recipient charities, when the recipient organizations, not all of them are charities, some of them are just community groups. When recipient organizations then want to make withdrawals on those funds, the fund manager, fund director will authorize withdrawals to come out of the Bank of Montreal account and be paid to the organizations. And that is what Tides US did. They never gave any of their own money to the tar sands campaign. They were always just a vessel, a conduit for grants flowing from other foundations. So that's probably the number one misconception. And by the way, Tides Canada, which now has another name altogether, was never a participant at all in the tar sands campaign.
Right. Now, the reason this is important, folks, is because Ms. Krause alleged that the foundations, the American foundations, were actually the initiators of the tar sands campaign, and that the
that's not true.
Yes, that's absolutely not true. And when I interviewed 15 environmental groups, and I interviewed 3 experts who are knowledgeable about how civil society groups operate, and what happened was between 2006 and 2008, a group of First Nations, scientists, environmental groups, communities got together in Calgary, and they held meetings to get organized, to organize the tar sands campaign. Then once they were organized, and by the way, the impetus for that was Prime Minister Stephen Harper's famous comment in 2006 about how Canada would use the oil sands to become an energy superpower. And knowing the climate and environmental consequences of the oil sands, that worried these environmental groups, and so they organized the tar sands campaign. And then what they did is they put this structure together.
So you don't need me, Markham. But you're right on all of this.
Yes, and there's much more to come, because this is an onion with a lot of layers, and the layers are important because Vivian got them all wrong. I mean, this is really the government of Alberta has essentially set up an inquiry, and a lot of its politics and political rhetoric are founded on an untruth, a lie, a false claim, on false data perpetrated, years ago by Ms. Krause, and peeling back those layers is not easy. It's not an easy narrative to explain, but it's really critical, because literally tens of millions of tax dollars are being spent on the basis of this bogus narrative. So anyway, the tar sands campaign gets organized. They hire a guy named Michael Marks out of San Francisco, who's an American consultant, and he and Zipporah Berman administer this thing and funnel applications into the American charities. And Sandy, that is essentially the way these things work, right? I mean, the foundations don't ever go out to environmental groups or any charity and
No.
ask and request applications. It's always the other way around. The environmental groups and charities are going to the foundations and making applications.
Yeah, this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions, is that this is being driven by these foundations out of the United States, when in fact the origin, and in fact even the documents that are being pointed to as showing, oh, it was the Rockefellers, they were behind it all. If you drill down into that slide deck that is referred to all the time, and you look at it closely, immediately what pops up are Canadian names associated with Pembina Foundation. Actually, I think it's Dan Wolowitz. I think, if I'm pronouncing that right, I think his name, I believe it's his name that comes up. There was a cross-border coordination in the sense that there were opponents of the Keystone XL pipeline in the US who were also opposed to it. And so some of the Canadian activists were also coordinating with Americans. But this is all driven by very practiced activists. I mean, Vancouver is the home of Greenpeace. We started all of this. We're the home of the War in the Woods and the Clayoquot Sound activism. Sephora Berman is, and many, many other people are longtime activists. They know this world. They know how to operate in this world, and they know where they can get international support for their efforts in pursuance of green objectives, and they did it.
Yeah, one of the points that came out in my interviews is that the bulk of the funds that were used to fund the tar sands campaign and anti-pipeline, anti-oil sands activism in general actually came from Canadians. And the estimates, nobody's ever, sat down and totaled up what the percentage is, but the estimates that I got from people like Keith Stewart at Greenpeace and the Sierra Club in BC and so on was probably, at the height of the tar sands campaign, 85 to 90% of their money actually originated within Canada. So what you really have here is you have a campaign that's mostly funded by Canadians, gets a little bit, 5, 10, maybe even 15% from the US and Europe. But what Vivian has done is turned it around and made the Americans the drivers of the campaign, the major funders of the campaign, and all of it, and then she's added a wrinkle which she kind of flirts with, because she said it and then she doesn't say it, but she says that they do it at the behest of the American oil and gas company to landlock Canadian oil. And
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead and address that, Sandy.
Well, I do think that environmentalists do want to landlock Canadian oil. I mean, I think that almost all of these activists would like to, this is their objective. I think they would, if they could, landlock Canadian oil. They would, if they could, just stop it altogether. They would stop all oil altogether. They're active and they are coordinated with other activists and other organizations around the world. This is not focused on Canada. That's the other thing, is that what people need to understand is that we get the tiniest, minutest fraction of all climate activism funding. I mean, I think that what I found is that we get about 1% of what these large foundations, what international foundations fund in climate activism. I think we get about 1% of all of it. So that's the other, I think that's another really important point, is that people, the implication, certainly Jason Kenney's implication, is that, the tar sands are being targeted and we're being picked on and we're being, that we're the victims of this highly targeted campaign. In fact, there is a global movement both to fund innovation, to fund activism, to change legislation. A lot of them want to get legislation changed to get the internal combustion engine outlawed in X number of years. There's a lot of initiatives, and there is a lot of anti-oil initiatives, and there are a lot of arrests going on of activism, of activists all over the world that are working on this. We are a small part of a global movement, a global cause to address climate change, and this is just one tiny part of it.
And here's another irony that's often lost on the oil and gas boosters, and that is that this was a spectacularly ineffective campaign, because during the time that it was operating, oil sands production doubled.
Yep.
And all of that went down to the U.S. So they
and if you listen to the narrative that's coming out of Jason Kenney, it's like, oh, look, the Permian Basin, the U.S. production went out of sight. Well, it went out of sight relative to every other oil-producing country in the world, every oil-producing region in the world. This was the Permian Basin expansion, the shale oil revolution. But in fact, Canada was the only, apart from the US, we had the highest increase in oil production anywhere in the world, I believe.
Yeah, well, that's right. And let's not forget that the shale oil is light sweet crude, and the bitumen that's produced in the oil sands is ultra heavy sour crude. They don't compete. They go to entirely different refineries, and comparing the two is just apples and oranges. So that's another thing. But here, there's another wrinkle to this, which is that they also really were not successful in stopping pipelines. I mean, in November of 2016, Prime Minister Trudeau approved the Trans Mountain expansion. He approved the Line 3 replacement. When 2017, when Donald Trump put the Keystone XL back on the table, he let that approval stand. And those three projects together total approximately 1.8 million barrels a day of new shipping capacity. And according to the Canadian Energy Regulator, Canada doesn't need another pipeline for 20 years. So the fact that the Northern Gateway pipeline, one project, was canceled, and for other totally legitimate reasons, just kind of gets glossed over. And so the industry and Premier Kenney portray the industry, Alberta as this great, the victim of all of it, and yet none of it actually had a practical application, very little. And I would argue that the industry, is just using this as a canard to deflect attention. But,
well, and that actually, Markham, gets to something that really concerns me and how I got really involved in this fight. Because if they had been successful, I don't think that's a bad thing either, in the sense that, to me, dissent and the ability to organize public campaigns, that's totally legitimate. And by the way, the oil industry is so massively better resourced than small citizens groups around the world. This is why foundations do get involved, and the amount of money that they put in is actually really small relative to the resources of the large oil interests who can advertise, whose lobbying budgets just dwarf anything that is coming in from charitable foundations to help community groups. But the other thing, and I've also written about this, especially when Jason Kenney was up a few months ago talking about, well, if this was Russia, like there'd be a lot different treatment of activists. Well, yeah, true. And around the world, human rights activists, civil society activists, environmentalists are being tarred with this foreign-funded activism trope. This is a very organized narrative that is being used almost everywhere in the world to discredit and delegitimize public dissent from whether it's oppressive regimes or climate issues, the Brazilian rainforest, all of these things. Wherever you go in the world, local activists who are looking for international support because to fight much larger interests and to object to much larger interests active in their regions, little small community groups that are just looking for a little bit of help here and there. Wherever you go in the world, they're being discredited as being part of a conspiracy.
Yeah, I want to chime in on that because regular readers of energy media will know that I've supported the oil sands for two reasons. One is I think that they can get to net zero emissions on their production. And two, I think they can make the pivot to materials like carbon fiber and away from producing input for fuels like gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. And if they are successful in that, Alberta can have 100 or more years of prosperity without contributing to climate change. So I think that that's possible, but yet at the same time, I've supported I've opposed this idea of shutting down the activism because they have the right to dissent. And the appropriate response from the industry and from the government is to make a better argument. If you don't like what they're saying, then go out and talk to Canadians and convince them that there's a better way of looking at this. They don't have the right to silence these people, even if they disagree with them. And I think this is a profound attack on Canadian democratic principles and needs to be opposed by even those within the industry who disagree with the tar sands campaign's objectives.
Yeah, that's the thing that got me interested. I don't come out of the environmental movement. I don't have very much relationship with it. But I got involved in this years ago. I started writing about this years ago, I think in around 2012, because I thought that this was extremely important, that Canadian citizens have the right to dissent. And if they want to organize, and if they want to get together with other groups, and if they want to be part of a global movement, this is a free country. You know, we have no problem with oil interests organizing and being part of international associations that try and drive their narrative. Nobody has objected to that, as far as I've heard. But for some reason, it's terribly illegitimate for little small mom and pop, community groups in dog pound Alberta to get together and have phone calls and emails with their neighbors in other counties.
Now, I want to talk about some more errors that cropped up in Vivian Krause's work. So one of the things that she never talked about, and if she was into those IRS databases the way she said she was, she had to know this. And this came out of an interview with Zipporah Berman, which is that after the Notley government in Alberta on November 22nd, 2015, after the Climate Leadership Plan was announced, the foundations basically looked at that and said, well, that's what we were looking for. We wanted Alberta to have climate policy, and now that it has it, it's time for us to redirect our funds elsewhere. And essentially that average of $4 million a year that the tar sands was getting from the US essentially dried up to a trickle. Mm-hmm. And by 2019, I think it was well under $1 million. So that was the information that Zipporah gave me. I then recontacted a number of the environmental groups, asked them, and they said, oh yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, we can show you, we got, 500,000 or 200,000 in these years, and now we get 50,000 or nothing.
Yeah, I could see that in my research too. And I looked at it from the documentation of the filings of the foundations. You could see it.
Right, and here's a key point. If Vivian knew this, and she didn't say it, and if she didn't disclose it, that really calls into question her ethics as a researcher. But if she didn't know it, that also calls into question her competence as a researcher, because she should have known it. If she's as accurate as the people claim that she is, and Brett Wilson has beaten me over the head on Twitter about this for months, it's either one or the other, because she has never publicly admitted on her blog or on Twitter or any place that this is in fact the case. And then you've confirmed it, I've confirmed it, and it needs to be pointed out. And this is a fundamental problem with Vivian's work. And Sandy, you don't have to jump in on this because I know it's sensitive for you. But look, I mean, I have been criticizing Vivian Krause on Twitter for years. And she has many, many times claimed that she was going to explain her research or respond to my criticisms. She was going to explain what really was going on. Not a single solitary time has she ever done that. I asked her for an interview for my deep dive last year. She didn't respond. She refused, or she didn't. She said she would, and then she stopped responding. This is a problem. If you're a valid researcher, you respond to criticisms of your work. Because if she's got the receipts, if she's got the goods, if she's got the data, it should not be a problem for her to come back and say, here is my response to that criticism. Here's how I can prove my work. She has not done that. And from my point of view, she is not a journalist as the Premier claims. She is not a researcher as the Premier claims and industry claims. She is, that totally invalidates all of the work that she's done. And she is, in my opinion, just a conspiracy narrative.
But Markham, I actually, and this, it's not just because of ongoing litigation that I really cannot discuss the researcher, but I'm actually also very concerned about how government has treated this. You know, back in 2012, when the Harper government, when the Harper government first came to power as a minority government, it was very happy to coordinate with the environmentalist community, and in fact, it partnered with Tides Canada, it partnered with the Moore Foundation, American Foundation, it partnered with a number with a number of these US foundations on the Great Bear Rainforest, and it happily did this, and it sang the praises of all of these groups. And then when they got a majority government, they immediately changed their tune. Suddenly, the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline that nobody had known about, suddenly this was on the table, and it was running right through the Great Bear Rainforest, where the Canadian government had just accepted tens of millions of dollars from American and international foundations for conservation purposes. But now it suddenly became totally illegitimate for these very same foundations to fund community groups to save the very Great Bear Rainforest that they had just partnered with the Canadian government to save. And suddenly we had people like senators standing up in the Senate. It's in Hansard, where they're talking about these foundations as being like Al-Qaeda. Literally, I'm not kidding you. They're talking about them as if they were terrorist groups that were trying to defeat Canada. And there were all of these committee hearings at which this researcher appeared and was giving all of this evidence. And those committees never called any of these foundations to come and give their own side of the story and to shed light. They basically, you know, as a trial lawyer, former trial lawyer, I can tell you, your case looks really good as long as you keep the other side from saying anything at all. And this actually offended me so much. And then suddenly there was, I think $13.5 million in CRA audits that were approved while the Harper government was cutting the audits, cutting the audit budget for tax evasion. Suddenly we were going after these charities. And so my concern isn't so much about, you know, any researcher, anybody can go on the internet and see what they can find. They can do these, that's fine and dandy. So I don't actually have that much problem with a single person saying these things. What I have a problem with is government then putting taxpayer money behind theories that they have not independently verified with experts. Like long before any of this happened, there should have been independent verification.
Right. And I agreed. And I wrote a column last year about how the government, at that time, the UCP and the industry were basically weaponizing Vivian's research for their own political purposes. But I want to make a point about these CRA audits. So I was going to do another deep dive on these. And I interviewed a number of people, and there's a tremendous, actually, there's quite a number of submissions into the CRA or into the government on changes that the Trudeau government made in 2018, 2019. That really lays bare what the debate really is. But here's the silver bullet for me. I was approached independently by a CRA employee and anonymously, because they were speaking off the record, and this person sat on the committee that did these reviews, that oversaw the reviews. And I asked that person, did you review Vivian Krause's research to verify it? And he said, we took a look at it, and it had absolutely no merit whatsoever. It was completely fallacious, wrong, inaccurate, and so on. It had no influence on the work that we did in our audits and the questions that we asked. And then I was going to do a deep dive on her allegation that the Great Bear Rainforest designation was a green barrier to oil exports. And I interviewed local indigenous chiefs, and I interviewed scientists. And again, completely and utterly bogus, as many of the comments that Sandy made, they verified. And the problem becomes that for me as a journalist, I could have chased Vivian Krause down all of these rabbit holes, and it quickly became apparent to me that they're so wrong and so flawed, and basically they are she is the Alex Jones of Canada, but I simply can't make a career out of rebutting Vivian Krause.
Well, that's that's part of the whole thing, is that there's so much complexity to this narrative that people just, their eyes glaze over because they can't follow it all. But I think that we should, as members of the public, be focusing on the fact that this inquiry is being funded by taxpayers to look into what are entirely lawful activities of Canadians. Canadians are totally entitled to, they have freedom of assembly, they have freedom of speech, we have all of these freedoms, and a government inquiry has been funded to go in and see what these Canadians are doing. Who are they talking to, and where are they getting their totally legally entitled funding? And here it appears to have been granted another. How long an extension did they get?
Until the end of October, and another $1 million.
So he's getting, and he's still, and we've just heard from former Tides Canada, now I think it's called Makewell Foundation or something. Because they've had to rebrand because they've been so discredited by all of this controversy. And after a year, they still haven't talked to them. I mean, how is that even possible that this inquiry that has been funded by taxpayer dollars still hasn't even talked to the main parties that are involved in this narrative?
Well, I think that actually illustrates the point. And I broke that story because I interviewed Joanna Kerr, the CEO of now Makeway, and Makeway. And I asked Joanna Kerr, and she said, look, and at this time, Jason Kenney and many of his ministers and many of the press secretaries on social media were slagging Makeway, and we know you were involved, Tides Canada, and rebranding won't change anything. We know who you are. So I asked Joanna Kerr, did the Premier's office, did the Alberta government, has the public inquiry ever contacted you to verify any of this information? They had not. So that public inquiry has been up and running for a year. Tides Canada figures prominently in the rhetoric and in the narrative and in Vivian Krause's allegations, and the inquiry can't even pick up the phone or send an email to verify information. So what have they done? Now, I wrote a column, and Sandy, you and I have had many conversations about this. So what will the inquiry inquire into? Well, the charities and foundations won't talk to them. The environmental groups won't talk to them. The only source of information left is Vivian Krause and her IRS database. And there is, I don't know what conclusions they will come to. I don't know what have they been doing. How have they spent $2.5 million over the last year to investigate something that's bogus and no one will talk to them about?
Well, they spent almost $1 million on the law firm of the son of the commissioner, didn't they? You know, on Denton's got 900,000 of it, and you know, I do all of this stuff pretty much like, you know, off the side of my desk. I research all of this, and so, but there's just so much. There's just so much more that's just so objectionable about all of this, and I just I don't understand why Albertans are. Well, I guess most Albertans have really bought this narrative hook, line, and sinker. But I just want to say a little bit more on this Tides Canada front, and now as you correct me, Make Way Foundation. You know, one of the things that I think that because there has been such a campaign to discredit and smear Canadian environmental activists, people are not speaking out. They will not criticize the tar sands campaign. Members of the environmental community won't publicly criticize. They're not going to break ranks. And I don't know if you encountered this in your research, Markham, but certainly in the conversations that I've had with many, many members of the community, there is not a united opinion that the tar sands campaign is the right way to address climate change in Canada. There's a big variance of opinion. And in particular, I know circumstantially, and I know from some sources, that Tides Canada never wanted to have anything to do with the tar sands campaign. It has not funded a dime of it ever, and even like it hasn't participated as a conduit, which Tides US did do. And a number of the foundations that have funded environmental conservation efforts, huge, you know, probably over $100 million. I'm just going off the top of my head, but the Moore Foundation, which is possibly the preeminent scientific foundation in the world today. It funds research at Stanford, at Oxford, at Caltech. Its president is Howard Feynman, who was the former he was the former provost of Harvard, like the chancellor of Harvard, ran the public health school at Harvard University, is currently chairing the US government's a COVID task force response team, along with Anthony Fauci. It doesn't get more solid platinum scientific credentials than the Moore Foundation, which has poured over $1 billion into particularly targeted conservation efforts in South America and the Pacific, North Pacific Ocean. Its focus is ocean health, and it has been treated and dragged through the mud and treated like it's some kind of like it's part of this horrible anti-Alberta conspiracy, and it has not had anything to do with it, nor has Tides. And it's very, very concerning to me how easily this narrative has taken hold, and everybody just jumps on and they just go Tides and the Moore Foundation, and it's really objectionable.
Now, we're going to wrap up and start taking some questions, but I want to echo what Sandy says. I mean, I get exercised about this as she does, because the allegations are so egregious, and they're based on lies and false information, and this cannot stand. In a democracy, we cannot base policy, we cannot spend taxpayer dollars on the basis of this. And it needs to be opposed, and it needs to be exposed for what it is. And unfortunately, it's pretty clear that the narrative is still accepted by the Kenney government and by the oil and gas industry. So with that, let's ask Val Jobson. Val, if you can unmute your mic and ask your first question, please.
Well, mostly I was going to say I've done historical research in a different area, and when you're doing research, you don't just get one set of figures is good, but you have to, go to all sorts of sources and spread your research farther and follow the evidence and learn as you go along. And I think Vivian has, found these numbers and she sits on them and hasn't really gone further with them. But
well, I
it's
can
just
tell
my
you,
opinion.
thanks, Val. I can tell, and I'll turn this over to Sandy in a moment, but I can tell you that I've been in contact with a number of the, when I was doing the interviews with the charities and the NGOs, and I asked them, did Vivian contact you to verify this information? And a few of them said, yeah, well, she sent us a couple of emails asking us to verify the numbers, but she never asked us to verify what it was used for. Or any other information. So the context around those numbers, she never asked to verify. That is, from a journalism point of view, that is a fundamental deficiency. And from a researcher, any kind of legitimate research point of view, that literally invalidates the conclusions that she comes to. So, Sandy?
Well, and it's nice to see you semi in person, Val, because I see you on Twitter all the time, and I know that the quality of the research that you yourself are doing and how well you know this field. And again, I don't want to comment on a single individual researcher. I'm just so concerned about how this narrative has taken hold and how little critical analysis there's been, and how much public money has been poured into this without anybody even taking the trouble to commission one of the major accounting firms to look into this. Just give us your take and do an audit of this research. That wouldn't have cost very much money to do that, to just get an independent opinion about the quality of this research. And that's, I think, the most shocking thing. And it's just so regrettable to see a province like Alberta that's really suffering, really suffering. And goodness knows how they're going to find their way out of this mess. But it's really, in a way, I think, exploitative of despair, individual despair in Alberta.
Well, let me tell us an anecdote that will illustrate the point of how serious this is in Alberta. So during the election campaign last year, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers CEO Tim McMillan was at the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce, and he gave a speech that was quoted word for word, excuse me, in the Journal, in which he said, thank you, Zipporah Berman. Thank you, Jane Fonda. Your foreign-funded activism has cost the Alberta government tens of thousands of jobs. And he went on and on about all. None of that is true. There is the data that says that is absolutely not true. And so I emailed CAP, and they were treated me as a journalist for years and have given me interviews with McMillan. And I said, I would like an interview with Tim. I want to know where he got this information from and verify it. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. I said, you can't, you're the largest oil and gas lobby group in Canada. You cannot say these kinds of things in public and then refuse to verify them and refuse to give an interview on them. This is not cricket. And they said, Markham, based on our perception of you is that you are no longer objective, and we're no longer going to.
You're a terrible reporter, Markham. You're a terrible reporter.
Yeah, because I didn't basically take their stuff at face value. But here's my point. I'm one of Sandy and I are two of the few journalists who actually question the orthodoxy and go back and verify facts and so on. And CAP has shut me down. And Albertans ought to be outraged by that. They ought to be that journalists who actually want to dig in and get the facts are being muzzled by organizations like CAP that are purporting to be, they're public-facing organizations. When I do stories and I send an interview request into the Alberta government, I don't even get the courtesy of a response,
And Markham, I mean, one of the things that what's really always surprised me in this is how little focus there is, even from the journalist community, which I understand why they are reluctant to kind of dive into this narrative because there's just so much, there's a huge amount of time involved in critiquing it. But where is the journalism about how large the oil and gas industry is? I mean, the market capitalization at its height of the foreign-owned corporations active in the oil sands was well over $1.5 trillion in market capitalization. We have no idea. There's no transparency from CAP about what its membership fees are, what its annual budget is, its legal, lobbying, advertising, PR, marketing budget, and how much of that is covered by foreign owned or foreign controlled interests in Alberta. I mean, there's been none of that. And I think that that's one of the things that really concerns me, is that the camera lens has been entirely focused in one direction only, without having any balance that, in fact, the oil industry is far more foreign controlled than the Canadian environmentalist community, and there's far more money involved in it, foreign money.
Well, I can actually give you some insight into what some of the media were doing, because I used to appear on radio shows talking about Vivian Krause's work, and after my deep dive, some of these talk show hosts, and I won't name names, began to ask Vivian questions, and she couldn't answer them, and she performed poorly on their interviews, and it became clear to them that I was right and she was wrong. I mean, it's literally that black and white. And I said, well, why don't you have me come on and I can explain in more detail what's going on? And they said, no, we're just going to let this drop. So the issue here, the unspoken
were those Alberta media formed?
No, they weren't all Alberta media. And the thing is, they got caught on the wrong side of this issue, and rather than fess up and say, okay, look, we maybe gave her a platform for way longer than she deserved, and we didn't ask the questions, they just swept it under the rug and they don't want to talk about it. Have you noticed that outside of the National Post and the Post media newspapers, Vivian has essentially disappeared out of the media?
Yeah,
it's because media organizations know she's wrong, and rather than counter this stuff with this narrative and Vivian with the facts, they have just agreed. They have decided that they don't want any egg on their face, and that is an indictment, in my opinion, of the Canadian media.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Sandy.
Well, it's because I've been watching, like I say, I've been reading and researching and concerned about this from 2012. So I've got a little bit of insight about how the media have covered it. Part of it is, I mean, it really was always a National Post narrative. It really never broke out of the Post media, foreign controlled media company. Concerned about foreign funding of environmentalists. It never really broke out of Post media, and for a lot of different reasons. There was a little bit of coverage back in 2012 when the Harper government was having its Senate hearings into this issue. And then I think that a lot of people, like, you really do have to, you and I both know how many hours, countless hours it takes to go in and do the work. I mean, this is an incredibly time-consuming exercise, and media has been under enormous pressure. They want easy narratives, and they like a good conflict, because that sells eyeballs or draws eyeballs and helps them. But I think that there's just been a reluctance to address it. But I've also heard from multiple journalists and multiple reporters that they didn't really want to give the story oxygen, and then it just kind of blew up. And now it's over again, I think.
Well, I think so. I think we've, as I'm fond of saying, reached peak Vivian, and we're on the downslope. Well, Sandy, thank you very much for this. This has been very enlightening, and I understand if our attendees have a little trouble putting all the narrative together. This is a highly, highly complex issue. There are so many angles to it, and there's.
Are there any stupid questions? I like stupid questions. I mean, are there questions that people have that they're concerned? Oh, I don't know. Maybe I don't know this issue well enough to ask this, or maybe there's a little bit of that.
I'll tell you what. We're going to have one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up. Michelle, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
This is kind of a stupid question, but if you guys are going to keep having these conversations, you need some flow charts, some org charts, maybe some string for the the connections. It's I was really interested. I'm starting from zero.
Yeah, it's like, well, good point. And Michelle, you can go and I know that Markham has done some good work on this. If you want to look, I did a piece back last September, October in the National Observer, and you can look it up, and it's called, let me just see if I can pull it up here. It is called a Data-Based Dismantling of Jason Kenney's Foreign Funding Conspiracy Theory. And there are graphs, maybe not flow charts, but there are some graphs there that show a little bit. So you can look that up.
I like that title a lot.
We really do have to wrap it up now. So thank you very much, folks. This will be on YouTube shortly. Sandy, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to do this.
Thanks, Markham.
And hopefully
nice to see everybody.
We'll wait till the report comes out on October 30th, if it ever sees the light of day, and then we'll come back and revisit that. That ought to be a very entertaining exhibit. So thank you very much, folks.